It is time for us to get started. Looking forward to being back in the book of Mark. We are going to be in chapter 10, right at the end of chapter 10 today. So you can go ahead and flip over there. We'll be starting in verses 46 through the end of the chapter here in just a moment. But just to bring us back up to kind of speed, if you will, remember that we are walking through the book of Mark, and Mark's intention from the very beginning is to lay out a kind of unbiased account, if you will, to help us see through the interactions of others, that Jesus is the Messiah. He kind of lays that out, his opinion out in the very first chapter, and then he kind of pulls back and he just gives us these accounts of all these interactions kind of over and over again. And we can divide Mark pretty easily up into three different sections. We call them three different acts. And so Acts 1 was their ministry kind of outside of Jerusalem. Act 2, which is where we have been in and where we will finish out today, is kind of their progression from the Judean area to the city of Jerusalem for the Passion Week events. And then we will start next week, that third act, which encompasses just that 1 week of the Passion Week, all the way through the resurrection, from Palm Sunday all the way through the resurrection. So we are finishing up that second act, and within that second act, we have been talking about the fact that you can easily, especially the second act, divide it up into three pretty distinct cycles. And those cycles are marked by Jesus declaring his coming suffering and betrayal, then the disciples doing something that just showed they didn't understand it. Peter rejecting him, James and John arguing over who's going to be the greatest. The disciples do something that just show that they just don't make the connection. And then Jesus kind of expounding upon that and turning their perspective upside down. Some have called, and then that happens three different times, three different declarations of Jesus, three different times the disciples mess something up, and three different times Jesus kind of unpacks that for them. And we've gone through all three of those cycles, and we're going to be at the end of this act today. Many have called this section, this middle section of John, the Great Discipleship Discourse, because it does talk so much about what it means to be a true disciple. And in so many ways, some other commentators have called this the upside down kingdom section of Mark, because Jesus kind of takes these perspectives and flips them upside down. The first will be last, the greatest will be the least, to be the greatest you must serve. And he kind of gives those upside down perspectives. So we do come today to the conclusion of this second act. And what's interesting here is that Mark parallels the conclusion of this act with the conclusion of the first act. And in some ways, he's setting up the conclusion of the third act. And so all three will conclude with blindness. So at the end of Act 1, we saw the story of the man healed at Bethesda of his blindness. Here, at the end of Act 2, we're going to see Bartimaeus healed of his blindness. And then once we get to the end of the book, we're going to see that Mark kind of ends his entire narrative with an account of basically the spiritual blindness of the disciples that just still can't see. The resurrected Jesus is standing right in front of them, and they still can't see and perceive what he's done. But we'll save that for a couple of months from now. So we're going to turn our attention now to this healing of Bartimaeus and see kind of what it has to say to us about concluding this great discipleship discourse that Mark has been accounting for us. So look with me, beginning in verse 46, and we'll read verse 46 through the end of the chapter. It says, "And they came to Jericho. As he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying to him, 'Take heart, get up, he is calling to you.' And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the blind man said to him, 'Rabbi, let me recover my sight.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go your way, your faith has made you well.' And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way." On October the 13th of 2011, in the small village of Foshan, China, a great tragedy occurred. 2-year-old Wang Yu, who became known later as Little Yu Yu, was hit by a delivery van. She was struck in the road, and the tragedy was simply amplified by the fact that the truck never stopped. He just continued on his way, and she lay there in the road. She lay there in the road for about 4 more minutes, and she was struck by another van that didn't stop, just kept on going. She lay there a full 7 minutes before a poor lady that was out gathering garbage finally took her, moved her to the side of the road, and called for help. Now, what made this from a tragedy into a travesty was the fact that the entire thing was recorded on camera. A security camera caught the entire thing. And during that 7 minutes that she lay there, 18 people walked by and never stopped. 18 people moved right by, saw her, and never engaged with her, never went to help her, never entered into the pain and suffering that she was experiencing until that trash collector finally came and got her. Unfortunately, Yu passed away a week later because of those injuries. One of as the national media kind of took hold of this story, they began to interview some of these people. And some of the passersby said, well, she wasn't my child. Why should I intervene? Why should I have done anything? One of the journalists, the local Chinese journalist, wrote an article about it with the title, "Shame on Us, China." And she railed on the Chinese culture for their disengagement with the poor and the lesser. And it's a tragedy, but I think it's also a poignant reminder to us that there are also very often small, neglected, unimportant, unvaluable people that we also ignore every single day. But the least are the very most important in the kingdom. And Jesus today is going to show us through his interaction with one of the least and forgotten of his time exactly why that is. Now, it's important for us to zoom out just a little bit from this single story and remember that this is actually in the context of this entire great discipleship discourse. In fact, this is connected directly to what we've just studied. Mark doesn't place this story here by accident. The Holy Spirit, through the hand of Mark, is he's not trying to give us this moment by moment account of every single thing that Jesus said and did. He's building a narrative of which we can understand Jesus' ministry and understand our calling into that. He's crafting this narrative to paint a picture of who the Messiah really is. And this story comes directly behind last week's teaching. If you back up into that previous teaching, you remember that Jesus has just taught the disciples exactly what it means to be great. In light of James and John's request to sit in places of honor, Jesus flips that on its head in verses 43 through 45, and he kind of gives us one of those upside down kingdom moments. If you look back up just a little bit in those verses, he says, "But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So now Jesus is going to show exactly what it looks like to serve others, to put the least first and himself last. And we know for sure that this is not just coincidence, because Mark leaves us a connecting phrase in the two accounts. If you look back in verse 36, when James and John came to Jesus with their request, he looks at them and he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" That exact phrase. And notice, as we just read in verse 51, when Bartimaeus comes, he asks him exactly, "What do you want me to do for you?" Do you think the ears of the disciples perked up when they heard that phrase? They've just come off of this interaction with Jesus. There's been indignation between them over James and John's request. There's tension there among the disciples. But I'm sure when they heard that exact phrase used again, they were paying attention. Jesus didn't want them to miss this connection, and the Holy Spirit doesn't want us to miss that connection either. So let's walk through some of these verses. We see first that they came to Jericho, and as they were leaving Jericho with Jesus and this great crowd, Bartimaeus, this blind beggar, begins to call out to him from the roadside, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And he was told to be quiet, but he wouldn't be quiet. So this would not have been the Old Testament Jericho location. We all remember Jericho from the Old Testament, the walls falling down. This is actually a different location. Would have been located about a mile and a half from that original location. Herod the Great came back in and kind of rebuilt Jericho. It was in a very strategic spot because of the oasis that it surrounded. And so he rebuilt it there. So this would have been the new Jericho. And this probably accounts for some of the what we'll call discrepancies in the wording between Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of this miracle. Matthew talks about two blind men, while Mark here and Luke also only focus in on Bartimaeus. And again, that's not necessarily an important detail. But Matthew and Mark share that it was when they were leaving Jericho, but Luke says as they were approaching, and that probably has to do with them focusing on either the historic or the current location of Jerusalem. Obviously, neither of those discrepancies cause any real problems, right? Only for those that are looking for a problem to begin with, does that cause any issues. But the city here is also significant because it is the last city in the Judean wilderness. It is the final stop before you start to make the ascent up to Jerusalem. And so this is a significant turning point between Acts 1 and 2, because we know, again, between Acts 2 and 3, because Act 3 is going to take place completely in Jerusalem. And so this is the last city before you begin that 3,500-foot ascent up to the city of Jerusalem. And so this is a distinct turning point here in the narrative. And Mark introduces us to this blind beggar, Bartimaeus. Mark actually shares the name of this person, kind of. And this is important because in most of the accounts, even in most of the Gospels, but especially in Mark's up to this point, he's shared a lot of miracles, but we haven't really been given the name of a lot of those people that have been healed, right? We've kind of been told the condition they were healed from. But here, however, this person, this hurting and forgotten one, is so important that Mark wants us to give him his name. It's a reminder to us that these least that Jesus is talking about, they have names. They have stories. They have souls that are important. But even in giving us his name, this beggar is so insignificant that he really doesn't even have a name. Mark, writing for the Gentile audience, he kind of unpacks this, right? He introduces him as Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. But that would have been unnecessary for the Jewish readers that would have been reading it at the time, because they would have known that Bar means son. We think about when Jesus calls Peter Simon Bar Jonah. He's calling him Simon, son of Jonah. We know what a bar mitzvah is. That is the point where a son becomes a son of the covenant, bar mitzvah. And so by calling this man Bartimaeus, he's indicating that he's so unimportant, he's so neglected in society that he doesn't even have a name of his own. He's just known by his father's heritage. This blind man is so worthless in society that he's only referred to in reference to his father. He just has no value of his own. In fact, there's even a deep irony in the very name itself, because his father's name, Timaeus, actually means honor. And so literally translated, this man's name would be son of honor, and yet he received no honor. It's a poor title for a man that received nothing from the world around him and had to beg for everything that he did have. And we see this clearly in the reaction of the crowd, this lack of value that is given here. It's an interesting kind of juxtaposition here that Mark lays out for us in the reaction that Bartimaeus has to Jesus and the reaction that the crowd has to Bartimaeus. Because first we see Bartimaeus, the reaction of this hurting and lonely man. He immediately begins to cry out, "Son of David." Now remember that this Son of David was a messianic title. This was an Old Testament messianic title. And one of the things that Mark has been trying to portray to us over and over again is that Jesus is the Messiah. One of the things that Jesus, through all three cycles of Act 2, has been trying to declare to the disciples is that he is the Messiah. And they just miss it and miss it and miss it. And yet here immediately Bartimaeus is calling him Son of David. He's giving him this most significant title. It lets us see, in contrast, his reaction to that of the disciples. Here Bartimaeus reacts with assurance and with faith in who Jesus is and what he can do. This title, Son of David, is obviously referring back to King David. We go all the way back to 2 Samuel 7 with the declaration that somebody from David's throne will sit on his throne forever. We studied that last year in 2 Samuel. And I wonder if Bartimaeus was thinking about how King David showed mercy on the crippled Mephibosheth when he called out to him for mercy. Bartimaeus certainly didn't have much tact, did he? But he did have a lot of faith. He did have a lot of determination. He did have a lot of perseverance. And I think there's something for us to be learned here that we can apply to our own prayer lives. First, he cried for mercy. He knew that God, through Jesus, owed him nothing. All he wanted was whatever Jesus was willing to give. He had nothing to merit it. He had nothing to repay it. He had nothing to demand it. And so he simply comes begging for mercy. He had no problem admitting his helpless and hopeless condition to Jesus. And I think that's a good indicator and reminder that in our prayer life, we should be as well. Even more so. Now that we have received so much mercy in salvation already, we know the depths of what God is willing to pour out on us. And so we should come admitting that we are helpless and hopeless and only coming as beggars before the throne of God to receive whatever he will give us. But I do think we come boldly. Bartimaeus certainly came in a position of mercy, asking for mercy, but he also came boldly. The persistent and energetic nature of Bartimaeus' prayer, cries, is a good example of what our prayer should be as well. He wasn't discouraged because no one led him over to Jesus. He wasn't discouraged by those that told him that he needed to be quiet. He took hold of that opportunity and he cried out boldly. I like the way that Spurgeon says it in a sermon about this passage. He says, "Take the gates of heaven and shake them with vehemence, as thou would pull up them post and all. Stand at mercy's door and take no denial. Knock and knock and knock again, as though you would shake the very spheres. But what thou wouldst obtain, cry out in answer for. Cry out, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. Cold prayers never win God's ears," he says. "Draw thy bow with full strength if thou would send an arrow up as high as heaven." And so too, I believe we should be willing to be bold in our prayers. We have been given an advocate in Jesus, an advocate directly into the throne room of God. And he has promised to speak there for us. And so now we should be willing to come. We should be willing to cry out boldly in the things that we want, the things that we desire, always putting them within the sphere of God's will, but crying out boldly for that mercy. Of course, this is a stark contrast, isn't it, to the disciples? We kind of already mentioned this. Bartimaeus' simple yet bold declaration that Jesus is the Christ, this Son of David, stands in contrast to the disciples who hear over and over again, 3 different times, told directly by Jesus, can't quite reconcile this man standing before them with the Messiah that was predicted to come. The disciples might have been uncomfortable with Bartimaeus' declaration. The crowd certainly was not comfortable. Not only do we see the reaction that Bartimaeus had to Jesus, but I think there's something poignant to be seen in the crowd's reaction to him. The crowd wanted Bartimaeus to get back in his place. Sometimes seen but never heard should have been this blind beggar. Quietly on the outskirts of town, some may have given him little, most probably gave him nothing, but now he's embarrassing them. I can just see them. "Shut up, you fool. This guy's important. Stop disturbing him. He doesn't want anything to do with you. You're just a beggar." This man meant nothing to them. To them, he was simply a distraction. In their minds, he was a taker, not a contributor. No one thought that he was important enough to stop this grand parade, but Jesus thought he was important enough. As we continue, we look in verses 49 through 51, and we see some of the most powerful words in this entire account. The single word, "And Jesus stopped." And Jesus stopped. What a powerful reminder of Jesus' desire to help the lowly, the hurting, the lost. Jesus here is on his way to give his life for the salvation of the entire world. Surely he's too busy for one single blind man. And yet Jesus is willing to bring this entire caravan of pilgrims to a screeching halt so that he might love one of the least. I think we can learn a lot about our priorities from Jesus. We must always be willing to choose people over task and always be willing to choose the least over the greatest. And if Jesus sets us an example of how to respond to the needy, then this needy Bartimaeus, he sets a pretty good example of how we should respond when Jesus calls us. There's a big difference, I think, between hearing and listening, right? If you don't believe me, just ask your spouse. Many of us are not really good at either, but most of us are better at hearing than we are listening, right? We might hear the words, but we don't necessarily take them to heart. We don't necessarily process them a way that we care or concerned or we're ready to jump to action. But here, Bartimaeus, he's listening and hearing, isn't he? And when the word is relayed to Bartimaeus that Jesus is calling to him, he not only hears, but he listens. And we see that in his response. He responds with abandon. Notice what it says, that he throws off his cloak. He sprang up and he came to Jesus. The Hebrew word, the Greek words used here are words of haste and energy. This is a picture of a drowning man that's desperate to reach that life buoy. Jumping up and running, listen, these are actions that are unfit for a blind man. These are actions that are dangerous for a blind man, right? The blind man's life is filled with caution. It's filled with external help. It's slow and methodical. But all of that caution is thrown off for the sake of obedience. When he heard that Jesus called, he responded. Oh, that we would respond in such a way when Jesus calls us to action. And then Jesus here makes this connection for us. Jesus repeats this question that he posed to James and John, bringing into clear, making it clear that what he's doing now is living out a living picture of what he taught them. And so he repeats this question, what would you have me do for you? And Bartimaeus responds again, boldly and plainly, doesn't he? Rabboni, I would receive my sight. The title here that he uses is a strengthened form of the rabbi that means Lord or master. When Bartimaeus said this, he's expressing his humble submission to Jesus. He's already declared him to be the Messiah, but now he's declaring him to be a personal Lord, a personal master. And the specific nature of Bartimaeus' request is a good, again, example, our note to our own prayers, right? Have mercy on me that he started, that is general. But his prayers moved from the general now to the specific. May I have my sight. Spurgeon continued in that same sermon. And he said, rest assured that those are the best prayers in all respects, if they be earnest and sincere, which go most directly to the point. You know there is a way of praying in the closet and praying in the family in which you do not really ask anything at all. You say a great many good things. You introduce much of your own experience. You review the doctrines of grace very thoroughly, but you do not ask for anything in particular. Such prayer is always uninteresting to listen to, and I think it must be rather tedious to those that offer it. Here, we're seeing this picture of one that is willing to ask specifically what he wants. But he's already declared that he is asking the master. And whatever the master wills is what he is willing to take. I think it also, again, puts in a great juxtaposition to James and John, right? James Edwards, in his commentary, says, the sons of thunder, they ask for extraordinary glory. But Bartimaeus, he asked only for ordinary health. But Jesus heard him. Jesus heard his cry just like he hears our cries. Jesus listened to his request just like he listens to our request. I think of several verses in the Psalms that immediately come to mind when thinking of this. Psalm 17:6 says, I call upon you, for you will answer me, O God. Incline your ear to me and hear my words. Psalms 54:2 says, O God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth. Psalm 71:2 says, in your righteousness, deliver me and rescue me. Incline your ear to me and save me. Jesus here certainly did incline his ear. He heard this request. He heard this prayer. After all, Bartimaeus is talking to God. And our Lord will respond in glorious salvation. Yes, I did say salvation. I think we can see very clearly in the final verses that Bartimaeus received a lot more than just his sight. Look in verse 52. It says, Jesus says, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and he followed him on the way. Job says in Job 42:5, he says, I heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. I think it's a beautiful declaration here, both literally and spiritually, of what Bartimaeus experienced, right? Bartimaeus had obviously heard a lot about Jesus. He knew who he was. He knew what he could do. But now he sees him face to face. His faith has made him whole, but it's also his faith that has made his relationship with his Creator whole again. Bartimaeus knew a lot about Jesus, but now he's had a personal encounter with Jesus. Bartimaeus has received the faith that heals, but now he's going to display a full faith that follows after Jesus. Notice that Jesus gives him leave to go, doesn't he? He says, go, your faith has made you well. Now, this is not a declaration that Bartimaeus needed some credit in accomplishing this thing, right? He wasn't the one that did the work. Grace is the divine hand that extends healing. Faith is simply the human hand that reaches out to receive it. So he's not giving Bartimaeus credit here. Jesus had done the work, but Bartimaeus had been willing to come and receive it, and receive it he did. The same word used here for made well is used elsewhere in the New Testament for being saved. Bartimaeus was healed, proven by his sight, but he was also saved, proven by his refusal to be sent away. Jesus says to him, go, but he will not. He chooses instead to follow. And I think this is what a true disciple does. I think that's why this is a great account to end this great discipleship discourse. I think it's a great picture of all that Jesus has been talking about. A true disciple leaves everything he has to follow everything that he has gained. Jesus, for the true disciple, becomes that pearl of great price. To obtain that pearl of great price in the parable, what does he do? The man gives up everything with joy to obtain what he has found. And a true disciple throws off his cloak, just like Bartimaeus did, in order to run hard after God. Danny Aiken says in his commentary, gospel gratitude will inspire us to follow at any cost, at all cost, the one who has so freely dispensed his grace to us. And so Bartimaeus becomes a picture of discipleship. John Grassmick says in his commentary, Bartimaeus pictures true discipleship so clearly. He recognized his inability. He trusted Jesus as the one to give him gracious mercy. And when he could see clearly, he began to follow Jesus. And so we have here at the end of this great discipleship discourse a picture of what a true disciple does. A true disciple declares Jesus as Messiah. A true disciple declares him as Master. A true disciple brings his petitions before God, and a true disciple follows him when he has been healed by faith.